I usually do the history of Tibet in 3 segments. The sources I refer to for the ancient period, I use a little bit Tartang Tulku's book called Ancient Tibet, which is a lot of fun, although he starts from the Big Bang, which is a little bit beyond my ability. Because he talks about, although I did learn one thing from that, his starting the Big Bang, which I thought was really great, which is that the earth in Tibet is twice as thick as it is anywhere else on the planet. Isn't that fun? The reason that Tibet is so high altitude, average altitude of 3 miles, is that the Indian plate slid under the Asian plate and we crashed into it, you know. And when it did that, that created a double thickness, and so that's why it is 3 miles high. So I did learn that from Tartang Tulku's book about how the earth is doubly thick. And it must make some difference in your life if you live on the earth and it's twice as thick. You know, you have like, we have this little skin, you know, on the earth, like the fuzz on a peach, you know, between us and the molten fire of the magma. In fact, here in New York, we only have like a little peach fuzz thickness. We think it's very solid, but it's very, very thin, really, relative to the diameter of the earth. And really, we're standing around this on little tiny, little fuzzy sort of thatch of rocks on top of magma, you know. Really, our life is like that. And then if it was twice as thick, that would make you feel better, I think. Okay, now, Tibetans themselves tell their history in a sort of magical way. They have a kind of, they have actually a theory of history, and in that theory of history, there are what they call 2 levels of history. And one level is what is called in ordinary perception, Tumumbenanga, and they tell all history in at least 2, sometimes 3, but at least 2 levels. And then there's Tumumaimbenanga, what they call, which means extraordinary perception. And then finally they have secret perception. You know, their lives are interfused with the presence of all kinds of supernatural beings. They did believe before Buddhism came there, as other tribes do, that there was sort of a more sort of boss god who was kind of a creator of the situation and who they looked to as a kind of all-powerful being. We don't know exactly how they formalized that, but it seems that they had that they refer to, and they associate those gods with certain mountains, and they felt that the kings came down on those mountains were emissaries of that main god, Yarla Shambho, but they're different ones. And Tibet was in that early period also very regionalized. Another thing that people don't really realize about Tibet is that Tibet is as large as the entire United States west of the Mississippi. Or it is as large as all of Western Europe, about 1 million square miles, the actual, and it's not really controversial. It doesn't relate exactly to the political divisions that are called Tibet today, you know, in the People's Republic of China, Tibet Autonomous Region, and this sort of thing. That's really a third of Tibet, the Tibet Autonomous Region. And the reason it's sort of undeniable is that it's the plateau, you know. And the plateau is average 3 miles high, and you can't mistake it. You know, it's a really huge thing. It sits right on the top of everything, and all the rivers come down from it. So it's completely unmistakable. And the people who are Tibetans who live up there have therefore special adaptations. They have different lungs, quite a different capacity of lung, and they, you know, they've been there for, you know, they had to adapt to be there. And then they feel they were there aboriginally, the Tibetans, but one doesn't know about that. I have always felt that the origin of the Tibetans was that people all around Tibet, on the Indian side, the Iranian side, the Chinese side, the Burmese side, the Mongolian side, the desert and the steppe side, the people who got sick of the normal struggle for life in the alluvial valleys or in the steppe sort of just kept getting away from it by going higher. You know, they were the kind of people selectively over many, you know, the hundreds of thousands of years, who generation after generation, just kind of, they would just cede the richer bottom land to somebody and just go up and go up and go. And eventually they ended up sort of on the top where relatively few people would have wanted to go because it was harder to live. One anthropologist, very interestingly, associates Tibet with the great nomadic arc, which runs from Siberia all the way to East Africa, to Kenya, actually, through Saudi Arabia. And it's like a vast nomadic arc, he calls it, vast arc of nomadism. And Tibet is kind of in a kind of, in the curve of that arc right here, you know, and it's the highest part. Its northern plain, or Jiangtang, is the highest step within that whole arc, and the life there is the hardest of all. It's the most difficult. You can have blinding blizzards in July and August, and to live there, therefore, those who live nomadically in Tibet at this high altitude step have the greatest nomadic skills. You know, as anthropologists rate the skills of nomadism, we would think, being New Yorkers, that nomadism would be easy, just wander around, follow the cows, you know. And first of all, cows can't make it on their own in Tibet. It's too rough for cows. You have to have yaks, as they call them in Wyoming, those hippie cattle. the long-haired hippie cattle, namely yaks. And yaks are different from other cows because they are not grazing animals, they are browsing animals. Really, they browse. They're browsers, not internet, but grass browsers. And what that means is that yaks don't bite off the grass, they lick it. They have don't ever get slurped by a yak, even the one you like. They have a tongue that is very abrasive. And they just lick the grass, and all the grass except the root comes off. But they don't bite, and therefore they don't uproot the grass, you see. They lick off the blade. And that way they can live in a very fragile ecosystem. The Chinese lately have been destroying the Tibetan steppe, piece acre by acre, by many acres, by favoring the purchase of wool from sheep and from the Tibetans, and getting the Tibetans, therefore, to have more sheep, who you know, desiccate the range by biting out the grass, you see. And then once goats get in, then forget it. They completely destroy it. Tibetan civilization is not just nomadic. It is what's called semi-nomadic. It's a symbiotic civilization because in the southern part of Tibet, an eastern part, which gets down in some places below 8,000, around 7,000 feet, 9,000 feet, some of the valley floors, there are some, since Tibet is actually the latitude of Mexico City, it's way below New York, it's quite tropical. When you get down to those altitudes, it gets quite verdant and warm, and you can grow quite a number of crops, and there's a very variegated agriculture and fruit. There are even orange trees there were in eastern Tibet, down getting towards Yunnan and the Burmese border, in that side. And so the Tibetan civilization arose from the interaction of the nomadic northern steppe people and these valley people who were sedentary and had a very wonderful system of agriculture. They had, in the old days, before the Indian slopes, southern slopes of the Himalayas were deforested, Tibet had very little direct rainfall. And what they had was glaciers that melted, so they had a very regular supply of water, and they had a marvelous irrigation system that kept them going, and they didn't have a monsoon cycle, and they didn't worry about drought, really. They had a very stable, but sparse, but stable agriculture. And it is those agriculturalists in those valleys that developed the kind of organization, town organization and so forth, that developed the first sort of Tibetan larger kingdoms and the first cities. And the nomads enriched them very much, and they interacted with the nomads, and they sort of would trade roles a little bit. But the Tibetan character and complex is the mix of these two types of people. It's not just a plain nomadic group. And in their own no one knows, there are 40,000 years ago, there are skeletons and things from Tibet. And that seem to indicate from the rib cage and things like that, already the Tibetan lung formation. So this kind of sense of Tibet being the nation of dropouts, which is my vision of Tibet, which may reflect a something personal, who knows, maybe my projection. Scholars always do project. But has to do with, it is also a lot in Tibetan myths, like, for example, in the Mahabharata War. Some of the lords who lost in the Mahabharata War from India were said to have gone up into Tibet. And in various myths of the nations around Tibet, they have they all think of Tibet as the abode of the gods. It isn't just Americans that have fantasies about Shangri-La. Even the Chinese and the Indians, they all did. They thought that Shiva and Uma were living up on top of Mount Kailash in Tibet, and that it was something very magical in Tibet, and they were like sort of mythical creatures up there. The Kinnaras lived up there, who are these reverse centaurs. They are human-bodied and horse-headed, and very erotic, and they used to live up there and play music in Tibet and things like that, in the Indian mythology, And in the western valleys of northern Afghanistan and that area, they also look to Tibet as kind of the ultimate highland, and they have myths about that too, as well as do the Mongolians. So Tibet has this thing of being mountain, near to the sky, axis mundi. For all of the big nations around Tibet, it always did have that approach, that kind of attitude. Now, it seems around 200, anywhere from 200 before the Common Era to 200 after the Common Era, the Tibetans began to organize more in larger groups and began to sort of raid outside a little bit. They began to develop kind of a militaristic society, and they date the first kings who they feel arrived on a mountaintop, the first king, as it was sent down by God. And the first 7 generations of kings would then go, before they died, they would climb back up to heaven on a rope. And then the next one would come down. They'd wait on that mountain and then come down. This mountain is near, just south of the Brahmaputra River, near the current modern-day Zetang, where the Tibetan kings would come down. And those kings then were supposed to also be some of, mythic world. You can have various kinds of identities. They also were identified with the people from the Mahabharata, some Indian kings and the races that produced the Buddha, and it relates to some of their early sense of connectedness to the Buddha. And they did have a religion, though, before Buddhism. Well, I want to jump ahead. So then they came down. Then they began to form, based on this center of the Brahmaputra River, where those agricultural valleys come up, and the steppe kind of comes down to that river, where they formed a larger group, and they began to conquer around themselves. They began to unify different tribes under their control. And over the next 3 or 4 centuries, probably from 200 of the Common Era up to around 500 or 600, they spread and spread, and a king, Songtsen Gampo, whose name was, we sort of really get into history that we know. We have documents, we have stone monuments and things. Songtsen Gampo, who is the late 6th century, 7th century, and he unifies the entire plateau and conquers actually parts of Nepal, conquered down to the Ganges in one area near Bengal, conquered to the west up to Afghanistan, to Baltistan and these places, past Ladakh into what is now Swat, northern Pakistan. Had quite a good frontier with China, but not as good as the next 2 or 3 generations of kings did. The Tang dynasty was just getting rolling then. There was the changeover from the Sui to the Tang, and so they were pressing the Chinese, and they were moving into the Silk Route, but they weren't already completely in the Silk Route at that time. So he is the king who, in a way, expanded the sort of dynasty or the administration of Tibet and spread the language of written Tibetan, created a language for written Tibetan, and sort of created a sort of began the process of creating a common cultural identity for all of the inhabitants of the plateau, basically. And he also is the king who began the importation of Buddhism. And there are different stories. Some people say that he did it because he was the incarnation of a bodhisattva, but I'll come to that in a minute. And then others say that he was just a conqueror, a fierce conqueror, and he brought in Buddhism to legitimize his dynasty, which probably both are true in a way. They don't have to be sort of a realpolitik interpretation and a spiritual interpretation. Probably both work together. In other words, what you needed for your dynasty, you would tend to see as a vision, and feel that would work, because it makes your life better, it makes the life of his people better. And in a way, we do find, if we look historically, especially in the history of Buddhism, that whenever an emperor conquers as much as he feels like conquering, so to speak, and that is more or less ecologically feasible given the conditions under which they live, they then turn to some sort of outside ideology to legitimize themselves in order to be able to control their own people without being on a constant military footing, if you follow me. And that's where Buddhism always comes in handy, because actually Buddhism itself in India grew up in a circumstance where there were 16 different city-states like Athens, Corinth, Sparta, Macedonia, whatever. There were these small city-states in Greece, and there was a situation like that in India at the same time when Buddha lived there. And so Buddha was teaching at a time when there was this sort of conflict for dominance between city-states, the way we had all over Eurasia during that period in the middle of the first millennium of the Common Era. And then Buddhism emerged through the next few centuries as a kind of dominant ideology that united and gave a kind of larger ethic and a non-militaristic ethic to whoever kind of won that battle. And then they sort of legitimized themselves in relation to their former rivals as sponsoring this universalist ideology, you see, because Buddhism has always been, in a way, sort of anti-tribal. That was sort of Buddha's move in comparison to other religious leaders at those days, 5th century before the Common Era. Most of the religions that were founded in that time, the leaders of the religions would meet God in some form or another, and then get empowered by God, the deity, formerly the tribal god, and then universalized in that period as a universal god. And then that god would give that person authority, and then they would set up a religion, and they would also create some dynasty would be legitimized by that. But in the case of Buddha, he met God, and then he demoted God. He said, well, God is cool, but he doesn't know, really. And he didn't really create it, and he doesn't really know what's going on, and he needs help, actually, himself. Although he's a big shot, he doesn't really know that much. And so he took the absolute away from God, you see, which in a way that move undercuts the tribalistic notion that we're the chosen, we have the thing, if you understand how it works. And therefore, Buddhism spread throughout Asia without war. It spread over different countries, and it was a way in which Chinese and Indians even could identify with each other, Tibetans and Indians, Bengalis and Madhya Pradeshis, whereas when they stuck with their local tribal deities, it was difficult for them because they didn't have a common fountain of identity. Just one guy could conquer the neighboring people for a while when he was stronger and richer and more lucky in war, and but then he would be toppled in the next generation. Now, in the extraordinary vision, of course, you have to go back to the extraordinary vision of the Tibetans, and they say that when Buddha was teaching in the world, when Shakyamuni went to India, Shakyamuni was in the Tushita heaven in the Tibetan vision, when he decided he was going to go down on earth and do the Buddha deeds on earth, do the Buddha show, he's going to put on the Buddha show for human beings to give them the inspiration that they might attain freedom and enlightenment someday. And when he did, he looked all around and he picked India because he said the Indians are the richest and they are the jolliest, and therefore they might be sort of sick and tired of the battles and the campaigns, although the Indians were not really pacifists when he went there. They weren't vegetarians, and they weren't yogis, at all, and they weren't Gandhis in those days. But he said India has the greatest merit of a country, and so I'm going down there. So at that time, different bodhisattvas signed up to take care of other people because they felt sorry for other nations that couldn't get the Buddha. They don't have a myth about which one decided to go to Greece, so we don't know who that was. I don't think anybody much came to England or France or these places. But maybe, but we don't have a record. But anyway, Avalokiteshvara said, okay, look, the meanest people in Asia here, the toughest, meanest, roughest people are the Tibetans because they live in that really wild place. And if I can tame the Tibetans in the Buddhist language, or civilize, let's say, if I can civilize the Tibetans, I can civilize anybody. So then he went down there and he did all these different things to help the Tibetans. So he was working for them already in the past. And then one day in the 6th century, he was sitting in his paradise, which is normally in South India on a mountaintop on the western coast of India. And he was sitting there with his two consorts, the green and the white Tara. And they looked at each other and they said, it's time now. And then meteor-like rays of light shot from the heart center of all three of them. And from the Somsen Gampo, from Avalokiteshvara's heart, this ray went shooting out and landed in the womb of the Queen of Tibet. And from the green Tara, the ray went out and landed in the womb of the Queen of Nepal. And the white Tara, hers went out and landed in the womb of the chief queen of the Tang dynasty of China. And then, they grew up little princes and princesses, and they emanated, in other words, the Tibetan view. And then, as soon as they got old enough, they started to bring Buddhism. But the way that they did it was that Somsen Gampo sent a war party to Nepal and a war party to China, and he said, give me that princess, and send up your best Buddha statue as her dowry. And the two Buddha statues from the two countries, which were supposedly in Tibetan myth, were made at the time of the Buddha's life. They brought with them at great, and you see in Tibetan paintings of these myths, in a chart, they dragged it all the way up from China. Although the king, the emperor of China, the one in Nepal didn't make much fuss, because Tibet was sort of close, and Somsen Gampo said, send up the princess, my good friend, and this and that, and if you don't, I'm going to come and lay waste to your kingdom. So that was easy, he sent up. But the Tang guy was stronger, and he was protesting a little bit, and so he made the Tibetan minister, who was Somsen Gampo's emissary, do many different kinds of puzzles and solve riddles, really wonderful things. He had, like, for example, a big turquoise that had all kinds of weird maze holes in it. and had to thread the turquoise. You had all these tests you had to do. And so nobody could do that. The Prince of Korea was there, the Prince of Mongolia, the Japanese prince, the Prince of a different kingdom that was South China in those days, and Vietnam. And they couldn't do it. So then he came and he dripped honey through the rock, the turquoise, and then he tied a very fine silk thread to the leg of an ant. Tiny ant. Then the ant went through the thing, eating the honey, for example. I mean, they're all these they're really wonderful stories about the Lumbo Gar, his name was, the Minister Gar, the famous Minister Gar. And he solved all these puzzles and problems. And then finally he got the princess, who was the White Tara and was ready to bring Buddhism and geomancy, many things from China, although she purported not to remember that she was White Tara, and she was weeping and wailing by going up in the dark, cold, gloomy, grisly country of Tibet, which you feel normally when you're living in a nice, rich, beautiful garden valley of China or India. You're afraid to go to Tibet. That's why Tibet was this sort of a remote and aloof place where only the gods would go. So then, anyway, he married. So then the two Taras come, and then they build temples in the Lhasa, and he moves his capital to Lhasa, and he builds this sacred temple, and they do all kinds of rituals, and he sends a minister to India to make an alphabet, and he makes the Tibetan alphabet, and then they begin translating Tibetan books, Sanskrit books, Buddhist books into Tibetan. And they build he builds a network of about 32 temples throughout central Tibet, which are all sort of state temples, and he invites monks from all the Buddhist kingdoms around Tibet, from Ladakh, from Turfan, from Khotan, from the Silk Route area, from China, from India, of course, mainly, and Nepal, and has them pray in these 32 temples, and the idea is that this is going to now civilize the Tibetans. So it was like, it is kind of an amazing, if you think of the Tibetans before that as kind of very fierce warrior group, suddenly this teaching about nonviolence and peace and transcendental liberation and so forth suddenly comes and shatters this sort of tribal mold. And it was quite a shock to them, I'm sure, and it took a long time for them to get into it, kind of, even though Avalokiteshvara was doing it for them, according to the Tibetan view. And the next few generations of kings after Songtsen Gampo did not really, they spent a little time patronizing Buddhism, and they kept building more temples, and they did this kind of thing, but they also had a lot of military campaigns, and by the 8th century, by the late 8th century, they actually, I think it was 754, they defeated the Tang Empire, actually, and sacked the capital, Chang'an, of the Tang dynasty. And from 754 to the 790s, or even into the 800s, the Chinese paid tribute to them not to come and bother them. And they were really a fearsome kind of dynasty at that time. But they were also would then come back from their campaigns. They would become emperor, apparently, around 15 sometimes, 14, very young. They would crown their kings and emperors, and then they'd go out and do battle until they calmed down, the hormones calmed down, And they were so tough coming from the high altitude that no one was any match for them, and everyone was afraid of them. But still, in those 2 centuries, they didn't have any monks. They didn't build any monasteries. They didn't really, they had temples and they had priests, which they mostly were foreigners. And a few Tibetans were learning, and they were beginning. What little idea we have of the sculpture that's left from that very early era, we don't really have much, but a little bit. You can imagine people who lived in this high altitude thing suddenly going into this sort of dark temples and seeing these giant beings, like meeting Superman or something, and hearing all these magics and myths and things like that. It was like a different reality suddenly became part of the Tibetan character and personality, but it took them a long time to quite figure out. It was like an alien, a close encounter they were having sort of with these people, and they would resist it too. There's a layer between a sort of tribal shamanism that was originally the Tibetan mode, and where they had, shamanistic priests who consecrated warrior kings, the usual sort of thing, the warrior king, the priest shaman, and a sky kind of religion with the high mountain and the deities on the mountains. And they had this sort of a scene with animal sacrifice and everything. And then they feel that they received a teaching from Iran area. And some have theorized that it was an offshoot of Zoroastrianism. But nobody has any real idea. They just say that because it comes from Iran, scholars, called Bön, which was called Bön. And basically Bön was a kind of tribal dynastic religion that glorified the emperors. which of course Zoroastrian glorified the Achaemenids emperors and was a sort of state cult itself. So in that sense, there may have been some Zoroastrian, but nobody really knows what Bön was, because later Bön is really just a complete mirror image of Buddhism, once Buddhism became sort of the dominant cultural influence in Tibet. But anyway, there was this layer between just sort of tribal shamanism and sort of dynastic, glorifying the emperor type of tribal/nationalist religion, which Bön was. And Buddhists had to contend with the Bönbo, and they had to the Bön tried to drive them away, in fact, and they were sort of competing with them as things went along. And the next great moment is the time of the King Emperor Trisong Detsen, who ruled in the latter part of the 8th century and the early 9th century. He was like 4 generations or 5 generations after Songtsen Gampo. He also had conquered the Chinese quite a lot, and he controlled the Silk Route, and he was very powerful. And he wanted to go a step further, and so he invited a famous abbot from India called Shantarakshita. And Shantarakshita came and was going to build a monastery. And he said, well, if you guys want to be Buddhist, you can't be Buddhist just with temples and praying to Buddha. That's not the point, you know. I mean, that's nice, but it's not the point. Buddha's whole purpose is for people to become liberated, to realize their own nature, to become educated, become liberated in mind, and even liberated from karma, liberated evolutionarily. It's a real educational process. It is not simply just a religious thing to pray, you see. So in order to do that, you have to have specialists, you have to have a faculty, you have to have monasteries, and monks and nuns, and people who spend their whole lives just in study. And the society should support them, and they are the true warriors of the soul. And you shouldn't give all your manpower over to just being warriors. If you want to be Buddhist, you have to diminish the warrior bit and turn that sort of militancy and that powerful death-defying energy into going into your own unconscious, transforming it, and becoming enlightened. So Shantarakshita, he was well-known in India, and he wrote many very important books that we have in Sanskrit still. He was a fantastic philosopher, like he was sort of the Kant or the Hegel of his day. Really remarkable. Huge tomes he wrote, compendia of all of the existing philosophies of the day, and brilliant analysis, and brilliant, lucid writer, extraordinary critic, and everything. A remarkable person. And he somehow went up there into that high altitude, and he tried to do this. But then apparently the Bönbo priests invoked all kinds of magic against him, and then they said that he would build up the walls of the monastery by day, and at night the local deities and the Bön deities would come and take the walls down because they didn't want to have the real Buddhism there. You know, they didn't mind maybe a couple of extra temples, but they didn't want the real whole cultural program that Buddhism brings. And so then there was a plague, I think, and there were some typhoons or something, some bad weather, hailstorms. And they said people got angry, and the Bön priest said that it's the fault of this Buddhist monk, and he's trying to do for something very un-Tibetan here, and it'll ruin our society. And so he had to actually leave the country. The king said, the emperor said, you better go. And now my treasury has become depleted because of all of this bad luck in building. So what are we going to do? I don't want to give up the project, but it's looking really grim. So then Shantarak said, okay, I'll go back to Nepal, take a break for a while, and you call up this guy, Padmasambhava. That's this fellow right here. He's there in his 3-storied mansion. He is a kind of adept, what they call a great adept, a tantric adept. And he therefore has kind of personal charisma and magical power. He's not just a scholar monk, an abbot like I am. And he can handle these local deities, Shantarakshita said. So go and summon him and ask him to come and help start the Dharma off properly on the right footing in Tibet. So then the emperor says, okay, fine. And he sends a mission to Nepal to go look for Padmasambhava, who's somewhere wandering around in India or Nepal. And at that point, Padmasambhava realizes this by clairvoyance, and he's in some cave in Nepal meditating. And he comes to the border of Tibet, just where the mission is, to receive him. And then they find him waiting for them at the border, like, what happened to you guys? And then he goes back with them into Tibet. And then it's a very memorable thing. And of course, now and then he has to take a break as they're traveling, and he says, okay, wait for 4 days, I've got to go up on this mountain. And he goes up on different mountains and caves, and then he does exorcisms, and he wrestles with the local deities. He's constantly turning into a great eagle-like, what they call Garuda, a great mythical bird, and wrestling with the local dragons, and serpent deities and things. Sort of like St. Patrick type, and he always defeats them, although there's lightning and thunder, and everybody quakes in their boots while it goes on. And then he comes back, and then they go on. Then when he gets to the royal palace, or the king comes out from the palace and meets him near the site of where he's trying to build a monastery, and then he doesn't bow to the emperor. So then the courtiers get really furious and drawn swords and the whole thing. What, you don't bow to the emperor of all Tibet and all this, the great conqueror of Central Asia, this kind of thing? And he says, no, I don't bow to him. I never bow to these kind of worldly Turkey kings. And they said, what do you mean? Who are you? He says, I'm the emperor of the Dharma, he says. And then he, apparently, in the myth, he takes his hand like this and he waves the hand and flames shoot out from his fingertips like this. So in order to avoid getting singed by the flames, they all have to bow to him, you see. I mean, it's a sort of status thing, but it kind of indicates maybe the amazing sort of inner energy of these enlightened adepts. This is the tantric adepts, which I haven't really begun to talk about. But anyway, it's a sort of it's the third type of Indian Buddhism, and there's a set of 84 of the major ones, and they were sort of people like this. Although this is a deity, but they were these kind of wild ascetics, who lived in this strange way, and they had all these magical powers, supposedly, according to the Indian and Tibetan culture. And they were very sort of awe-inspiring, anyway, is the point. And even though they had no weapons, they somehow overawed this militaristic king with all his generals and everything by their sheer force of personality, we could say, if we don't like to believe in the magical powers, in our modern way. So then they immediately took note of him, and then he said, okay, I don't, like Bodhidharma, he said, I'm not hanging around in the court. I'm going up on top of this mountain. There's a mountain on the Brahmaputra just below where Samye Monastery is built. And it's a low mountain, like a sandy hill in the middle of a kind of bowl around the river. And he went up on top of that mountain. He said, just bring me some food now and then and stay out of my way. And then there was like, a month of huge storms and tremendous hullabaloo, and tremendous racket from up there. And apparently the emperor became nervous finally, and he rode up there against orders. And when he got up there, all he saw was like Mothra versus Godzilla, Really, that's what he saw. He saw a giant dragon fighting with a much bigger bird. And as he watched, the bird swallowed the dragon, finally, mastered it and started swallowing it. And just a little bit of the dragon's tail was lashing out of the mouth. And meanwhile, he was going, hello, Sambhava, where are you? He was freaking out, supposedly, this emperor. And then somehow he distracted the bird at the last minute. And as he did, the dragon turned into a small little serpent and slipped out of the bird's mouth and scuttled away. So then Padmasambhava, the bird turned back into Padmasambhava, and he was very angry with the emperor. And he said, you should have abided my orders. By distracting me, you loosed that deity again. So after a while, there'll be a big setback for the Dharma in Tibet, which wouldn't have happened if you'd stayed and kept down there and had a little more patience. But now there's going to be a big problem, he said anyway. So the emperor was duly chastened by this. But anyway, after that, then suddenly all kinds of gold and timber and lumber and metal was brought to the shores of the river by the deities who'd been taking it away all this time. And they easily built the rest of the temple, and Shantarakshita came back and they ordained some monks. And then they had about a 50-year-long conference in which they translated thousands of books from Sanskrit, and they also collected Chinese books, and they collected Central Asian books, and any languages that they could find Dharma books, and they brought them in and translated them and created a whole very beautiful system of translation for Tibetan that was very flawless, like an artificial language at first, that very beautifully reproduced the Sanskrit grammar and orthography and everything. And one of the great feats of translation really in history then occurred the next 50 or 60 years. That also is the time when they gathered physicians from all over Asia and even from Iran, Greek physicians, and they created the Tibetan medicine system based on both Chinese, Indian, Iranian, and Mongolian and their own indigenous sources. And so it was an amazing cultural time. And this is around 800 of the Common Era. And Tartang Tulku likes to make comparisons. He says the early 8th century of the Common Era were the earliest texts in English using the Roman alphabet. He has all these different law things when they were first written. 7th century, the Tibetan Constitution was written. 1215, Magna Carta was written. The Russian states were founded in 850 or 950. Charlemagne codified the Germanic tribal laws in 802, around this very same time. It's kind of nice to see Tibet. You see, Tibet has disappeared from the world for the last 50 years, you see, because of the Chinese annexation of Tibet, invasion, occupation, and annexation of Tibet. And then the world trying to ratify that and pretend that it didn't happen, so it wouldn't have to mount a desert storm or wouldn't have to, like, try to defend the freedom of these people who seem to be too hard to defend. And so they've sort of disappeared. But then if you look at the founding of the Tibetan nation, like that big moment in around 800, it's when they began writing English in the Roman script. They didn't have their own English script yet. And the Tang dynasty was in its height in China, and Charlemagne was in Europe. Right? England was still really nowhere, pretty much. Some Saxons were running around. I guess Merlin and Arthur were running around. So Tibet really is a very old and very amazing culture from that time. The other last thing I want to say before leaving, the old thing about Tibet is that the tumuli of the Tibetan kings, up until the time that this happened, when they began to have the first monastery and really began to learn Buddhism, they had this thing of like pharaonic type of thing where they would have huge tumuli, with the kings buried, with all kinds of possessions and things. Not so much people. Some of the very earlier ones, there were a few people thrown in, just to wait on them in case in the afterlife, But not so many, they weren't so heavy on the people like a pharaoh or something. But they had horses and yaks and things, and gold and jewelry, and they were huge things, like Egyptian pyramids. I mean, they were a really big ancient civilization. They weren't just a bunch of hillbillies up there. They were really quite a big group. And they really did raid and ravage an area of maybe 2 million square miles at the height of their empire. So they were like a kind of Genghis Khan group. The only difference between them and the Genghis Khan group was, of course, they were 600 years earlier, one, and then two, lucky for all the people around them, having grown up at 2-3 miles of altitude, they never wanted to settle down where they would go conquer. They would loot and pillage and demand tribute, and then they would take back off up to the high altitude. Because apparently once you get acclimatized to the high altitude, I mean from birth, you can't really acclimatize in a single generation really very well. At that height, you cannot actually, which is one reason Tibet will be saved no matter what in the long run. Because nobody can really live there, the whole life. Then you get lung diseases, you die young, etc. It's not comfortable because it's just too high, for long term. Average 3 miles this is. This is not just Aspen like 8,000 feet, 9,000 feet. This is 3 miles, 15,000 feet. And so they didn't ever want, when you used to living there though, you like that altitude. You have visions, the oxygen in your brain is different, you sort of turn down all the time up there. You don't like to be down in some lowland with some heavy, too much oxygen, you feel heavy and it's tiresome, and you love this vast space and these incredible landscapes of Tibet. It's really amazing. The landscape of Tibet is really awe-inspiring. It really is. Both the vast, broad spaces, the verdant valleys. It's not all like sort of like Mount Everest. Everyone thinks Tibet, everybody's like some sort of yeti or snowman, abominable snowman on top of Mount Everest. Not at all. There are these beautiful verdant valleys, beautifully, neatly cultivated with little irrigation dikes and things. And then there's vast, huge steppes that are very green and rolling, absolutely brilliant green in the summer. And then in the summer, the high valleys, the yaks, with their browsing, they create a green sward that goes up to 14,000, 15,000 feet. It isn't just rocky and barren. It's like green grass growing all the way up, which the yaks are licking and slurping on all over the place. And the beautiful waters and icy rivers and glaciers. I mean, it's really quite an amazing. The sky, the color of the sky is just awesome, and the stars, cloud patterns because of the billowing, the swirling Himalayan winds. They're really the fluffiest clouds. You cannot imagine how fluffy those clouds are. They're totally fluffy, totally fluff. Best in the best sense of the word, fluff. So then a whole bunch of pundits came, and Padmasambhava had 25 main disciples who were Tibetans, who were all became adepts, they said, and they would like float off on sun rays, and they would go live underwater, and they would bring up treasures from the dragon kingdom, and all this kind of thing. A lot of magical things went on, and then they only managed at first 7 monks, and then those ordained more people, and they didn't ordain any nuns, which was a bad mistake. For some reason, they didn't have the nun transmission, but there were some queens who became, novice nuns and things, and they had nuns, but they didn't make enough fuss about the nuns because, of course, they were warriors. They were this macho bunch, and so they were just like the early Indians who were very macho when Buddhism came there, and so they were sort of like Zen, like samurai style, little bit like this, and they're meditating and they're praying at that time. And then what happened was, in fact, the incompatibility of the two ideologies emerged within about 75 years, meaning that the grandson of Trisong Detsen, who had this great moment around the turn of the 9th century, the grandson of him, Relwachen, was so devoted to Buddhism. He had monks sitting on his throne. He would sit in a little chair there, and everything was for the Dharma, and he sort of forgot about his empire, and he forgot about his generals in the field, and he forgot about his maintaining his treaties with the Chinese and with the Mongolians and the Uyghur Turks and the different people who were around. And so the empire began to erode, and battles would be lost, and generals would come from instructions, and he would say, sit down and meditate and forget about it. So in fact, the sort of military discipline that had held the empire together began to crumble. And then in an attempt to save it, some of the way it's put usually in the Tibetan history is that the Bumbo, that is the former religion, not the shamanism, the ground level shamanism that still exists even in some very remote regions in Tibet, but the intermediate state religion of the Bön, they protested and they led a faction that backed a certain cousin who then assassinated that king and then persecuted Buddhism for about 10 years, and then himself was assassinated. And then the whole unification really of the plateau fragmented, basically. And then the place re-regionalized, something like that. And they kind of gave up their empire. They weren't immediately swallowed by China or swallowed by India or Nepal or swallowed by the Turks, because again, nobody wanted to go there really, you see. Nobody ever really invaded Tibet and stayed there in its whole history until the 20th century. And they wouldn't have done that even then if Mao Zedong had had enough imagination to realize that this flat map that he looked at wasn't flat in reality. And he thought he's like Thomas Jefferson. Wow, the Louisiana Purchase, man, look at this huge bunch of land. I'm going to be on top of India. I want to be right up in the face of the Russians. I want that big piece, And we're going to have 60 million Chinese in there in 10 years, he said, in 1949 when he invaded. First thing he did when he took power in China was invade Tibet. And of course they didn't. They still don't have, they have only about 7 million in there, and they're all like, gasping at oxygen masks and things like that, because it's just too high. It's too high. Their wives have to go down and have babies down in one of the lowland cities nearby, because it's dangerous to have a baby at that altitude if you're not acclimatized in this deeper genetic acclimatization way. The baby can get brain damage and so on. So, but these leaders in Beijing never realized that, you see, because the technology enabled them to think they could conquer all these things. But I'm sorry, that's a digression. Anyway, so they fragmented in about 850, but luckily for them, the Tang Dynasty was going through a big fragmentation at that time, and also nobody really, as I said, wanted to go to Tibet. So they then were able to revert to their more regional structure, but by that time, and it's called in the Tibetan history as a kind of dark period, when there's sort of no light of the Dharma shining and all the temples are still closed and people have forgotten what was in them and this sort of thing. But I think that we all think, scholars today think that isn't really an accurate depiction, because suddenly around 950, about 80 years later, 930 to 950, suddenly everybody in Tibet is just totally into Buddhism, like 4 or 5 generations later. And if it had all disappeared and nobody knew anything for 5 generations, that wouldn't really be very likely. They'd have to start all over again, kind of. Whereas when they go at it again in the second wave, it's an incredibly intense, powerful thing that happens in Tibet without a central dynasty enforcing on everybody, now let's all be Buddhist type of thing, which was the way it was in the first period, you see. But anyway, that's called the period of the early dissemination of the Dharma in Tibet. And that's the period where Padmasambhava is the main figure. There's some other important people like the emperor, the 3 emperors, Songtsen Gampo, Trisong Detsen, and Tri Relwachen. And the Shantarakshita, the abbot, is a very important figure. Vairochana, the translator. Vimalamitra, the mystic. There's a number of important figures, and then the 25 major disciples of Padmasambhava. And then Yishit Tsogyal, there's this great Tibetan queen who was really happy when the Buddhists showed up, because she had a hard time earlier in life. Although she was ravishingly beautiful and everybody was after her like mad, they even fought wars over her, she also had a hard time because she had a third eye in the middle of her forehead. Like one of these Tibetan deities. She had 3 eyes. She had an extra eye, And some of the Tibetans found that a little hard to take. You know, they thought she might be a demon or something like that. So only when she got with some Buddhists who were into having third eyes, they thought it was great. So she was in fashion again, you see, so she liked that. And she became one of the main consorts of Padmasambhava while he was in Tibet. And she herself did tremendous amount of teaching, and she was an amazing character. Yishit Tsogyal. I divide the three forms of Buddhism in India into sort of three segments according to an ancient pattern: monastic Buddhism, Messianic Buddhism, and apocalyptic Buddhism, I call them, which are basically the individual vehicle, the Mahayana universal vehicle, and the tantric vehicle. And India was transformed in a certain way from the way it was in Buddha's time until about 1,000 of the Common Era, or even 800, or even this time when it starts to come to Tibet, in three waves, you could say, where each of those styles of Buddhism was predominant, although the later style that would predominate would not wipe out the earlier style. And so there's a way in where I sort of schematize this, which I can't go into in detail here, about how it took the society that as the Buddha found it, and first applied the monastic antidote to militarism. And second, once the monastic antidote had calmed the society down institutionally, so that at least half of the energy of the extra energy, macho energy, was, instead of going into fighting each other, was going into fighting with yourself to become enlightened in a monastic educational program. After they had sort of calmed down, and the level of manners and the level of altruism and the level of individuation also had increased in society for about 400 or 500 years, the Messianic style became very dominant, which was, now that we're more calm and we pay more attention to each other, now we can also be more positively loving with each other. We can have a more positive, sort of saintly, virtuous, heroic ethic with each other, and we can make an active way of transforming our world into a more and more positive type, like a messianic thing. You know, the bodhisattva idea, where everybody vows to sort of make the world the best possible place that it can be, you know. So and in their own society, that means they sort of get this kind of do-gooder energy more about the society, if you know what I mean. And it becomes more of a common ethic, which is a more aggressive stance for Buddhism. In other words, if you have a really militaristic, warrior, fierce society, and you immediately tell everybody they're supposed to go out and do good, then they're going to laugh at you, you know. So first you get them to calm themselves and learn to meditate and withdraw from the battle, kind of, and have the struggle go on in the inner plane and win the struggle by becoming peaceful. Then when they're more peaceful, then they can intervene with each other and do good things for each other without just pretending to. They really can, because they're more patient, less hostile, less impatient, and they can. So then that style becomes really strong from about 0 of the Common Era to 500 of the Common Era. And then around 400 or 500, you begin to get this apocalyptic style, which is, well, let's not think only about long-term progress and long-term heroism. Let's accelerate this transformation, evolutionary transformation of self and society in a more powerful, more rapid way. Let's transform the whole universe immediately, or relatively immediately. In one life, 5 lives, 8 lives, or maximum 16. Which is a very short time in the long million-life sort of evolutionary panorama, so to speak. And that became very powerful in the latter phase of Indian Buddhist civilization, from 500 of the Common Era to 1,000, which is the time that the whole transmission came to Tibet. And that really brought women out in force, demanding the more immediate result. It brought out a lot of magical things, a lot of aesthetic sort of level of things, and sort of an emphasis on immediate fruition and attaining enlightenment quickly, and not sort of wasting a million lives or something, or deferring always the goal, but sort of dealing with being near the goal in a more powerful way, more magical, really, way, you could say. Therefore, I call it apocalyptic, because apocalyptic doesn't just mean, Armageddon. It also means revelatory and immediate. Some sort of immediate revelation, like a vision of the kingdom of God in the Western language, the kingdom of God being imminent now, not waiting for somebody to come some later time, you see. Okay? So I'm saying in India, these three sort of petals of the Buddhist flower unfolded in Indian society over 1,500 years. Sort of slow, as it spread in all the different, and of course there was no Indian society, you have to remember. India itself has always been many, many nations, different languages, different cultures, the Marathis and the Bengalis and the Keralis and the Tamils. I mean, they're very, very different people, just like the Portuguese and the French and the Germans and the Scandinavians. I mean, they're really different. It's not like they're all one people. So Buddhism spread from one of them to the other, all through all these hundreds of languages that you have in India. And while it was doing that, it sort of developed these three progressively developed layers of kind of transformation in the people. Like with the apocalyptic one, for example, the depth psychology, the unconscious became mobilized. These paintings, these fierce paintings of these fierce deities, like the deities of the between. This is a painting on the bardo of the between fierce deities that you meet after death, if you need fierce deities. It is a real miracle of history, really, because the Tibetans at the Buddha's time were just they weren't even really formed into a very big empire. And then by the time that they first had Buddhism, they were a ferocious bunch of Genghis Khan people. They were not like looking for enlightenment, They were not looking for the Dharma. They were looking for rape, pine, loot, and pillage type of thing. And then somehow they met. It's like in that story of Padmasambhava. He meets this emperor, and then they're about to kill him for not bowing to the emperor. And then he says, "Oh, I don't bow to emperors." And he goes like this, and there's flames shoot out of him. And then the emperor grovels to avoid being like fried, you see. So, I mean, that's just we can take that as a symbolic story, but it means is that the power of this sort of educational form and the almost magic of it and the inner energy of it was so amazing that these complete violence-prone people turned around in a few generations into seeking some much higher way of living and being, although then they would go back and forth, and a few people would go in this generation and a few more in the other. So it took a while, but the Indian progression had taken 1,500 years. Here, in a couple of centuries, the Tibetans went through a much faster and more progressed phase, really. So that kind of by 1300, they start around 700, by around 1300, they have become pretty much Pacific. And after 1300, they kind of go past where India ever got. Once we get a sense of what they were in the ancient period, then for 1,300 years until now, from 600 of the Common Era, it's a collision between this very ferocious conquering society and this thing called the Dharma, or what the Buddhists themselves called the taming, the Vinaya, the taming program of the Buddha. How to tame. Because, see, the Buddha feels that a person, a warlord or something, or a warrior, tribal person, or whether male or female, doesn't matter, a tribal person who, feels that the life consists of self versus other, and therefore conceives that the larger social thing is my family or my clan or my tribe versus the neighboring clan or tribe. And it's like dog eat dog sort of thing, And, when I burst into fury, I have to go and conquer Troy. Somebody messes with me. I have to have vengeance down to the 15 Hatfields and McCoys and sort of this sort of thing. Someone steps on my toe, I have to chop off their leg. They don't consider such a person civilized. Or they consider a person like a wild animal, like a lion or a tiger. They're untamed, Now, nowadays, of course, we've become so wimpy in modern times, we think wild and crazy is kind of cool, Unless somebody wild and crazy assaults us or something, then we don't actually think it's cool. But, when Bill Murray is wild and crazy, we think it's cute. But in another sense, a tamed horse is the nice one that you like to ride on. You don't want to, tame a dog, you want a pet, You don't really want a Wolverine around the house, who might eat your hand, if he was a little extra hungry. So the transformation of a society from militaristic to pacifistic is like the transformation of a human being from being wildly defending their ego in a certain way and ready to assault anybody, except temporarily someone they've taken on as an ally and identify with as a family or a clan or a tribe or, in the modern times, a nation. And versus a person who, feels the life pulse of others equally to their own life pulse in a way, is sensitive to the other, doesn't feel paranoid about them necessarily, and can control their own impulses, main point, really can control them, which, we still can't do. I mean, of course, I'm not saying, but just, We are still a militarist empire. We're one of the last on the planet. We have the biggest military structure. We sell arms all over the place. So we're sort of like the Tibetans were, in a way. Now we are. Even though we're so modern, we have cars and subways, we think we're great. We know some science, but our science is all mainly used for violence against the environment, against neighbors, nuclear weapons, against animals, DDT, something. So if the Tibetans could be changed, there's hope for us, maybe. That's the point. Excuse me? Well, they're just Tibetans. Yeah. I mean, nowadays they're very big on we're not Tibetans, we're Chinese, which is a modern national thing. Culturally, they're totally the same, and they have two.